the silence that waits in silence. The first thing I noticed was how surprised the silence felt. After years under the constant hum of the city, the quiet in the flat felt almost apologetic, as if it had been holding its breath and finally wanted to let me in. I sat on the windowsill with my knees up and realized I could hear the building thinking soft, mechanical thoughts. A water pipe settling, a muffled footfall 2 floors down, a refrigerator sigh. It was a polite, patient silence, the sort that seemed to leave room for me to speak if I wanted to. By the second week, I began to catalog the quiet like an old, familiar friend. There were small rules. The radiator would sigh twice at midnight. The television across the hall would never be louder than a dream. The streetlight would blink once, an almost human stutter when the weather changed. I found myself listening at unexpected times, leaning into rooms to catch the way the flat answered me back. When I spoke aloud, asking the empty air about trivial things, the silence never quite remained mute. It arranged itself around my words, as though to keep them company. I found the cassette player in a box under the sink, among mismatched utensils and a pack of light bulbs. It was heavy with a past I couldn't read, dense like scabs, a scuff where a label might once have been. When I pressed play, the tape caught, and at first all I heard was a soft fabric of static. Then, buried in the hiss, a voice. Not quite a voice I recognized, but familiar in cadence, as if someone were remembering a name they had never been allowed to speak. It said nothing coherent. It hummed the edges of sentences, polite fragments like the silence around me. Curiosity slipped into a bruise. I recorded the static on my phone and played it back at different times. The tape didn't obey my schedule. It rearranged fragments as if choosing when to be generous. Sometimes a laugh hung in the background like a moth caught in the hiss, and other nights there was a slow scraping that could have been a chair or a mind turning on its own. When I paused the recording at random, the silence around me changed. The radiator stilled a heartbeat earlier. An elevator refrained from its polite groan. The building listened too, it seemed, and learned to wait. Mr. Larkin lived 2 doors down, and the first time I met him, he nodded like a man who'd been keeping a ledger of people's habits. His curtains were always drawn, his answers were small, measured. He never knocked, he slid notes under floors, the kind that made me think of delicate, secretive syllables. Once, when I mentioned the tapes, he did not seem surprised. He pressed his lips together and said, softly, "Silence is different for those who listen first." I asked what that meant. He only looked at his hands and taped the crease of his curtain, a motion that held both ritual and care. The pencil page arrived, folded between my door and its frame. A tiny square of hospital white paper covered in the same repeated mark, a shorthand I could not translate. It felt like a code left by someone who thought words too loud. I pinned it above my desk and watched the room change its manners. The clock in the hall, the brass piece everyone referred to with a kind of fondness, would stop half a minute after I noticed the page, then begin again when I turned away. Once, while I stared at that stop, I swore the hush in the building bent toward me with intent. Sleep grew theatrical. I woke at the same dozen-minute pattern and floated to the living room, as if pulled by choreography. nights became a series of careful experiments. I would clap, whisper, or sing a line I had never finished and wait for the flat to answer. Sometimes it gave me nothing but the proper decay of an old building's breath. Other nights it offered small echoes, the ghost of a cough, a hesitated syllable that seemed to refuse to land in any face. I began to feel observed, not by eyes, but by an empathy that kept pace with my pauses. One evening, I set up a recorder in the stairwell and left it running for hours while I made tea. When I later listened with the lights off, the tape did not reveal footsteps or doors. Instead, there was a rhythm I couldn't name, a measured inhalation, a tiny scritching like someone dragging a finger along a single thread. Between those grains of sound, the silence rearranged itself into patterns that almost translated into meaning. I felt as though the building were teaching me a new grammar, built from pauses and the strategic absence of noise. When the voice from the tape became a habit, I stopped trusting the calendar. Days lost their names and were measured by how many times the silence tilted toward me. Sometimes the playback offered a phrase so precise it felt like someone had found the shape of my own thoughts and given them back. Once it hummed my name, not in my voice, but as if my name were a memory being tested, and the room answered with a long, patient pause that felt like a question. I realized my curiosity had a cost. The building was learning which windows to open for me. I started leaving small things for the silence to find. A sprig of rosemary on the stair banister, a folded note placed on the landing, a glass of water on the windowsill. Each offering changed the way the hush responded. The rosemary produced a tiny, bristly noise like a throat clearing. The water made a ripple that matched the inflection of a phrase caught on tape. The notes were never returned, but sometimes the pencil page would appear elsewhere, as if moved by hands I could not see. The flat's attentions felt less like accident and more like correspondence. One night, the cassette hummed a sentence that landed like a coin in a dark pocket. We keep waiting for someone to listen back. The phrase was not accusatory. It was plain and patient, like a weather report. My throat tightened. I realized then that I had not been discovering the building's secret so much as being welcomed into a conduct of waiting. The silence wanted conversation, but it preferred a certain cadence, slow, deliberate, punctuated by long rests. To answer improperly felt like addressing someone in a language they didn't expect you to know. As I learned the pauses, I grew bolder. I began to speak back on purpose, offering sentences with soft, measured endings, imitating the hush I had come to heed. The building answered with a patience that felt like education. Doors in far apartments opened a millimeter, curtains trembled, somewhere a radio tuned between stations and found a nearly silent song. Then the pattern shifted. The silence stopped approaching me and turned toward the stairwell. It was subtle at first. The stair's grain seemed to hold its breath. But then the flat and the hallway synchronized in a way that felt like a held breath, becoming a single mind. The nights became crowded with listening. Sometimes it was liberating. My life reduced to experiments, to learning an eloquence of pauses that left my daily anxieties oddly manageable. Other times, there were fractious moments when the hush slipped and I heard a small, disgusted sound, like a throat cleared too soon. Those breaks felt like a presence testing its boundaries. I found my heart mapping around the minutes of silence, like someone drawing a coastline, careful not to cross the line where curiosity might become an intrusion. Then one morning, the building answered with something entirely new. A pattern of knocks, not hard, but deliberate, spaced like a sentence spoken in Morse. I opened the door to the stairwell and found it empty, but the pattern repeated up the shaft and down into the darkness, as if the building had found a method for speaking to itself. I pressed my ear to the cold railing and tried to translate the knocks. They formed a rhythm that made my skin prickle, not menacing, but curious, like a neighbor asking permission to join a conversation already in progress. I wanted to be brave and record the knocks, to give them to the tape, and see if they would become words. I did, and when I played the tape later, the knocks returned. But now, the silence layered itself more thickly around each sound, as if the building had learned to fold attention into the spaces between. For the first time, I felt watched in an unromantic, ineffable way. Not by a face, but by a concentration so steady it made me feel like a speaker being judged by scholars. I began to wonder whether listening back would require a sacrifice I hadn't anticipated. The climax arrived in a small, ordinary hour. I spoke plainly into the tape, asking why the building listened, what it wanted. The reply was not a voice, but a sequence of layered silences, each one slightly longer than the last, arranging themselves into a cadence that felt like someone handing you a question they'd rehearsed for years. Then the cassette gave a single clear phrase, not loud, but perfectly precise. Stay still. It was not an order as much as an invitation. My muscles noticed it first, then my mind. I understood that reply as both comfort and constraint. I tried to obey and to test obedience at once. I froze in my chair and waited for the cadence of silence to ease, imagining that if I held myself like a statue long enough, the building would bloom with answers. Time thinned into a series of attentive completions. The radiator exhaled, the stairwell knocked softly, and the tape hummed a long, patient note that felt like approval. But approval brought no explanation. Instead, the hush settled like a pet around me, and I realized, with a small, focused dread, that some conversations were less about resolving mysteries and more about learning how to belong to a community of attention. In the aftermath, I found loose endings harder to bear than final answers. The flat never offered a tidy explanation. Rather, it granted communion through a grammar of silences. I left a note for Mr. Larkin once, folded precisely, asking if he had always heard it this way. His reply came 3 days later, a short line written in small, steady letters. We only wait for those who will answer with patience. He did not invite me over. The building kept its rituals, and I kept learning them, which felt both like safety and like being kept under a benevolent, persuasive authority. Weeks bled into a pattern I could no longer say if I had chosen. The silence had taught me to listen with a care I hadn't known I possessed, but at a subtle cost. My life had narrowed to the edges where the hush responded. I would sometimes step outside and find the street loud and intrusive, a world that answered me with horns, arguments, and the staccato kindness of strangers. When I returned, the flat folded around me like a patient animal. I learned to ask softer questions, and the silence answered in its own wary, exacting tongue. On the last night in the flat before I left, not because I was forced, but because I wanted to test whether I could, the building paused, as if taking a breath it had never learned to give. I packed slowly, folding the pencil page and slipping it into my coat. When I turned off the lights, the hallway clock stilled in the most ordinary way, and the step outside felt loud and indecent. I hesitated at the threshold, listening for the quiet to plead. It did not. It waited, patient and inscrutable, as I walked away, and realized that silence keeps its favors like a friend who does not forget.